Welcome all to the GinGee GoodEarth history programs. I'm reading from the book that was printed 1830, A Universal History of the United States of America, written by C.B. Taylor. And I'd like to start the program by introducing a great thought of the day. We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, therefore, is not an act, but a habit. Aristotle. Next, I would like to read for the veterans. My father was a Navy Seabee, and he died quite young. He worked very hard at shipbuilding, and he owned a tugboat on the Hudson River, among all the other wonderful things that he accomplished in his life. And he always said, you have a guardian angel over your shoulder. No worries, no stress. Well, this is a great, favorite, beloved poem for the American people, and it's written by Edgar Guest. It's called It Couldn't Be Done. Somebody said that it couldn't be done, but he, with a chuckle, replied that maybe it couldn't, but he would be one who wouldn't say so till he tried. So he buckled right in with a trace of a grin on his face. If he worried, he hid it. He started to sing as he tackled the thing that couldn't be done, and he did it. Somebody scoffed. Oh, you'll never do that. At least no one ever has done it. But he took off his coat, and he took off his hat, and the first thing we knew, he begun it. With a lift of his chin and a bit of a grin, without any doubting or quit it, he started to sing as he tackled the thing that couldn't be done, and he did it. There are thousands to tell you it cannot be done. There are thousands to prophesy failure. There are thousands to point out to you, one by one, the dangers that wait to assail you. But just buckle in with a bit of a grin. Just take off your coat and go to it. Just start to sing as you tackle the thing that could not be done, and you'll do it. That was very nicely written. I enjoy reading other writers' poems. And again, I want to introduce the program by saying, keep on feeling, be a flower, art and prosperity of feelings. Flower. And I have my beautiful rose that I picked from the garden today, and it's quite beautiful. So it's a perfect rose. Every rose is a perfect rose. There we go. And I want to get started on the 1830 book. And we're going to, this is the second program today. So we're going to get started. And I'll zoom in on my picture show. Hope you enjoy it. And we're going to start where we left off. This is Roman numeral 4, part 3. And I remember the last words I said were, the instrument was executed on board their ship on the 11th of November. Mr. John Carver, a man of distinguished abilities and eminent piety, was chosen their governor. Now the prospects now before them were such as to appall any other than our fathers. In a most howling wilderness inhabited by pagan savages and wild beasts. A dreary winter was approaching. No shelter from the tempest, and as yet no place of abode. They had one resting place, and that was all. Their trust was in him who hath said to his chosen, The eternal God is thy refuge, and underneath are the everlasting arms, and he shall thrust out the enemy from before thee. And I shall say, Destroy them. After several unsuccessful attempts to find a convenient place for their residence, a party sent out for discovery entered the harbor of Plymouth in severe storm on a December night, having with their little bark narrowly escaped a shipwreck. They were cast upon an island in the harbor. This was on Friday night. The next day they dried their clothes, concluding to remain on this little island till after the Sabbath. This little band, about 20 in number, observed the day as Sabbath, which was the first Sabbath ever observed in a religious manner on the New England shore. Having examined the harbor, they returned to the ship, which weighed anchor and brought their concerted cargo in safely. Here these pious pilgrims landed on the 22nd of December, 1620. They called the place Plymouth, the name of the town from which they last sailed in England. They now had a country and a home, but they had a better country on high. They had now to contend with the inclement seasons, with innumerable privations, in constant fear of savage foe. But God had prepared their way before them. A descending plague, which prevailed among the natives about 3 years ago, had nearly depopulated those parts of the country. On this account they received very little molestation from the savages for many years. Had they been carried to the Hudson River according to their intention, where the savages were numerous, there is much reason to believe the little colony would have been cut off. Infinite wisdom directed their course to their prepared habitation. We have heard with our ears, O God, our Father, have told us, how thou didst drive out the heathen with thy hand, and planted them. The severities of the season, their unwholesome food, and their insistent labors brought upon this little flock a general and very moral sickness, so that 46 of their number died before the opening of the ensuing spring. Of those who survived, the most had been severely sick. Who can contemplate this little band in an uncultivated wilderness, with no promise of support from their mother country, exposed to the inclement skies of a dreary winter, with the scanty supplies of food, utterly unskilled and destitute of the means for the cultivation of a new country, with no security for future harvests, surrounded with a savage enemy, whose seats and prowess they could not know, visited with a raging disease, committing at times 2 or 3 in a day to the grave. Of the living, scarcely enough who had strength to perform the rites of sepulture without despondency, firmly determined to abide the just appointments of heaven, and not admire a virtue with the religion of the Lord Jesus alone can furnish, and patriotism to which the canonized heroes of Rome could never attain. Had their object been to obtain a property for themselves and for their posterity, or to obtain a name among the heroes of enterprise, they had sunk under their sufferings. Their souls were strengthened with other prospects. They confided in the wisdom of heaven. They firmly believed that the Most High would here plant and maintain his church, that he would make the American wilderness like Eden, and her desert like the garden of the Lord. Buoyed up by faith, strengthened by the promises, obstacles vanished before them. They knew God had often led his church into the wilderness, but he had never forsaken her. He raised up the righteous man from the east, brought him to the strange country. The Canaanites was them in the land, but he gave them as the dust to his sword, and has driven stubble to his bow. On the 5th of April, after their arrival, the Plymouth Company were called to mourn the loss of their excellent governor, and a deacon of the church, Mr. Carver. Mr. Bradford, a gentleman of distinguished worth, was chosen to succeed him, and, excepting 4 years, he was annually elected to office till his death in 1657. A little ally elected to the office. A little before the death of Mr. Carver, the Indian Sochem Massaret came to Plymouth in a friendly manner, and entered into a treaty of friendship with the colony, which he observed inviolably till his death. He was father at the famous Sachem King Philip. After the first desolating sickness, the people of Plymouth were generally very healthy, and the most of the first planters who arrived and survived the epidemic lived to an old age. Their privations, however, and their sufferings, inseparable from the circumstances of their situation, were great in the extreme. Their property was principally held in common stock for the support of the whole, and the wants of the few first years consumed most of their stores. Through fear of the natives, having received some threatening intimidations from some of the tribes, they were necessitated to erect a fort, to impel their whole village, and to keep a constant guard. In their excursions to find a proper place for settlement, while their ship lay at the Cape, they found about 10 bushels of Indian corn, which had been buried, for which they afterwards paid the owners, which helped to preserve their lives in the first winter, and afford them seed for planting in the ensuing spring. Some friendly Indians taught them the manner of raising their corn, but their crop was very unequal to their necessities. Mr. Hutchinson is of opinion that no English grain was raised in the colony previous to the year 1633, when a few ears of rye were produced. Just like for fun, apples were not a staple in North America. The apple came from Europe. The first domestic cattle were brought to the colony in 1624. previous to which they had none for milk or labor. The most credible historians affirm that these pilgrims subsisted in repeated instances for days and weeks together, without bread, feeding upon the wild nuts of the woods and shellfish. Their difficulties for clothing were equally great. Some of the ancient writers intimate that the great mortality in this first winter appears to have been the means, under a wise providence, of preserving the colony from perishing by famine. And again, honey, the honeybee did not exist in North America. That was brought over from Italy so they could produce honey. The second summer after their arrival, the settlement was threatened with a famine by severe drought. From the third week in May to the middle of July, there was no rain. Their corn, for which they had made their utmost exertions, withered under the heat of a scorching sun. The greater part of it appeared irrecoverably a loss. The Indians, seeing their prospects, observed they would soon be subdued by famine, when they should find them an easy prey. A public fast was appointed and observed with the great solemnity. The morning and the most of the day was clear and hot, but towards evening the clouds collected, and like the gracious influences of God, the rain descended in moderate yet copious showers. This revived their expiring crop, and produced a plentiful harvest, after which they observed a day of public thanksgiving. I believe this to be the origin of our annual Thanksgivings. This event made an astonishing impression on the minds of the natives, who saw and acknowledged that the God of Christians was great and good, and a hearer of prayers. In the autumn of 1621, the plantation received an accession of settlers of about 35 of their friends from Holland. In the year 1625, their venerable and beloved pastor, the Reverend Mr. Robinson, died at Leyden in the 20th year of his age. The 50th year of his age. He was thus prevented from ever seeing his much-loved American church. After his death, the most of his congregation came over to Plymouth. The planters who first came to Plymouth were accompanied by Mr. William Brewster, a ruler elder in the church, who supplied in a good degree the absence of their pastor. He was a man of abilities and learning, having been liberally educated at the University of Cambridge, and of great piety. Being an able and useful preacher, he served the congregation in that capacity the greater part of the time till his death, about 23 years after the first settlement. The congregation, however, enjoyed the labors of other ministers during this period. This little colony continued for many years in harmony, and were perhaps as eminent as any people which have appeared in modern time, for continuing steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship, and in breaking of bread, and in prayers. In 1621, the Virginia Company passed an ordinance establishing the constitution of the colony. This provided that henceforth there should be two supreme councils in Virginia, the one to be called the Council of State, to be appointed and displaced by the Treasurer and Company, and to assist the Governor with advice on executive subjects, the other to be denominated the General Assembly, and to consist of the Governor, the Council, and 2 burgesses to be chosen for the present by the inhabitants of every town. The Assembly was empowered to consult and determine on matters respecting the public weal. W-E-A-L. It was declared until confirmed by the General Court in England, and the ratification returned under its seal, and that, on the other hand, no other of the General Court should bind the colony until assented to by the Assembly. In 1622, the controversial which had for some time existed between the Crown and the Company concerning the importation of tobacco was at length adjusted by amicable agreement. The King had demanded high duties on the article, while he admitted its importation from the dominions of Spain, and had also restrained the Company from transporting it directly from Virginia to their warehouses in Holland, to which expedient his exactions had driven them. It was now agreed that they should enjoy the sole right of importing the commodity into the kingdom, for which they should pay a duty of 9 pence per pound in lieu of all charges, and that the whole productions of the colony should be brought to England. The industry of the colony had now greatly increased. At peace with the Indians, their settlements had extended not only along the banks of the James and York rivers, but to the Rappahannock and even to the Potomac. It now became extremely inconvenient to bring all causes to Jamestown before the Governor and Council. Thus originated the present county courts of Virginia. In this year, the cup of prosperity of which the colony now began to taste was dashed from their lips by an event which shook to its foundation and nearly destroyed the colony. In the year 1618, Powhatan, the most powerful of the Indian kings in Virginia, who after the marriage of his daughter to Mr. Rolfe had remained faithful to the English, departed this life. So we will end there on page 35, and I will read this other wonderful article, and I hope you enjoy it. Now, this was written July 6, 1964, and it was in our local New Kensington stroller, and it's called Coincidence. And I'm going to have to flash some light on this because I can't see. So, I am sure most of you have heard or seen the following, but these facts on Lincoln and Kennedy are interesting enough to pass on in written record. 1. Both of our presidents, Lincoln and Kennedy, were concerned with the issue of civil rights. 2. Lincoln was elected in 1860 and Kennedy was elected in 1960, the year that I was born. Both were slain on Friday and in the presence of their wives. 4. Their successors, both named Johnson, were Southerners, Democrats, and had previously served in the U.S. Senate. 5. Andrew Johnson was born in 1808, and L.B. Johnson was born in 1908. John Wilkes Booth was born in 1839, and Lee Harvey Oswald was born in 1939. Both presidents' wives lost children through death while residing in the White House. Lincoln's secretary, whose name was Kennedy, advised him not to go to the theater. President Kennedy's secretary, whose name was Lincoln, advised him not to go to Dallas. Women in the office pass on this historic quote: "A wife always has the last word in an argument. Anything a husband says after that is the beginning of another argument." George Eckel. Who's arguing? So we'll end the program today, and again I want to give thanks and prayers to all veterans who served in the armed forces, and I hope you enjoy the program. And this is the iLook Studio, and we will continue on with the book, The History of the Universal History of the United States of America, and I also will be reading in its entirety the book on the Vikings, which I started in my previous videos. So please, I only have, I think, 12 videos now, so start from the beginning so you can get the rundown of information about what my goal is, what's my objective, and you can review the Pittsburgh Victorian Gibson Girls and Joe Pye Music Festival, and I have books that I wrote on the honeybee beekeeping and the honeybee history, and White Buffalo Spirit I co-authored, and also Pittsburgh Victoria and All That Is Gilded, and I have many volunteer service hours in the Pittsburgh region. One that I really want to talk about is, I helped plant and build 12 garden beds for Natrona Comes Together, and you can look that up on the internet, Natrona Comes Together. And we also planted 14 fruit trees, and now that there's such a time of need, I'm so glad I worked on that project as a volunteer, I would say like 5 years ago already. And so that Natrona area, which is home of the Salt Works and Allegheny Ludlam Industries, which was International Steel Corporation of America, that was founded in 1891, that community will now have food available as their needs require, because we partnershiped with Grow Pittsburgh and we built those garden beds, and each garden bed is maintained by a community person to grow fruits and vegetables, and so hurrah, so that's a great thing. So always try to look at your community and see how you can help. Now this picture right here of the chained humanity at the park, I don't agree with this statue, because it reminds me of, chained humanity, enslavement, and I have no idea why that statue's there at the park. But I'm very aware that we, in some instances, when you're reading or you read articles, it might give you the idea that we lived in a chained humanity, but we are people who have free will